The Boston Massacre was not a solitary random event that came out of nowhere. Tensions had been brewing for some time between colonists and Great Britain, and the Boston Massacre was a tragedy in the making. Let's take a look at the setting and background of this pivotal event in American history and explore what triggered it, beginning with taxes. Wars cost money, and the French and Indian War, the larger conflict of the 7 Years' War, was no different. This conflict between Great Britain and France left Great Britain in debt, and they decided that the best way of filling their coffers would be to look to the colonists. After all, they were protecting the colonists during the conflict, and therefore the colonists should pay their due share. Of course, this was done without consulting the colonists first. The colonists had become accustomed to Great Britain's benign neglect, which often included a lax attitude in how colonists conducted business, allowing them a great deal of autonomy. This renewed interest in the colonies and what they could do for Great Britain was not welcomed. The Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 burdened the colonists with heavy taxes on items imported from Great Britain. These taxes riled up the colonists because the decision in the British Parliament to tax was made without anyone to represent the interests of the colonists. To mollify the angry colonists, the British then passed the Declaratory Act of 1766, which repealed the Stamp Act. However, the Declaratory Act also made it clear to the colonists that they did not have a right to representation in Parliament. Then, to add insult to injury, the Townshend Acts of 1767 was passed. The Townshend Acts levied import taxes on items such as tea, glass, and paper, and the money from these taxes, instead of replacing the financial losses of the French and Indian War, went towards paying the salaries of the colonial governors. Prior to this, it was colonial legislatures that had the power of the purse and decided on a governor's salary. In addition, the British insisted that the colonists quarter British soldiers who were being deployed to the colonies. This was just another blow to colonial autonomy, and the colonists rose up to boycott British goods. Samuel Adams, a leading member of the radical patriot group the Sons of Liberty, took the opportunity to write the Massachusetts Circular Letter and laid out the colonists' grievances against the British and the actions that could be taken. Colonial resistance and an increase in British soldiers was a disaster waiting to happen. Every fire needs a match. There had been clashes between citizens and soldiers, one in which a child was killed. On March 5, 1770, things came to a head in the Boston Massacre, which describes a famous skirmish between colonists and British soldiers that ended in colonist deaths. A group of rioters gathered to intimidate a single British soldier, Hugh White, who was guarding the customs house that housed the Massachusetts colony's treasury. In the evening, Hugh White faced a crowd throwing snowballs, rocks, and other projectiles. At some point, Hugh White struck out with the butt of his rifle, and someone was injured. Rage took over the crowd, and White was in a precarious situation. Hugh White somehow managed to get the message out that he needed help, and additional British soldiers arrived. They formed a defensive wall in front of the customs house. It is unknown whether the first shot from the British was intentional or not, but after the first shot, allegedly by soldier Hugh Montgomery, a fusillade ripped through the crowd. By the time the firing stopped, the colonists had to contend with many wounded survivors, and in the end, 5 of the colonists died. The aftermath of the Boston Massacre was a boon for revolutionary propagandists, like Paul Revere. Instead of quelling the colonists, it invigorated them. The British were depicted as murderers, and their character impugned, while colonists were portrayed as the exact opposite. The fact that both sides were probably equally guilty in the event did not seem to have any impact. The British soldiers were put on trial for their actions and defended by none other than John Adams, the future second president of the United States, and a cousin of Samuel Adams. Most were found not guilty, and a couple received branding as a punishment for manslaughter. In the ensuing years, the colonists continued to oppose the British, including dumping over 350 chests of tea into Boston Harbor in 1773, as revenge for import taxes on tea. This event, known as the Boston Tea Party, was performed by the Sons of Liberty. Additional acts of rebellion would continue, until a spring day in 1775, with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. The 1770 Boston Massacre was a skirmish between colonist rioters and British soldiers that ended with 5 colonist deaths. It was the result of a number of factors inciting resentment in the colonists, including the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, which were passed without colonist representation, the Declaratory Act, which repealed the Stamp Act but clarified that the colonists had no right to representation, the Townshend Acts, which used monies from the import taxes to pay the colonial governor, whose salary had previously been subject to the colonial legislature, thus taking more power out of the hands of the colonists, the expectation that colonists would quarter British soldiers. Patriot Samuel Adams, a leader of the Sons of Liberty, wrote the Massachusetts Circular Letter outlining the grievances of the colonists and the actions that could be taken. The massacre itself happened on March 5, 1770. A crowd was taunting and harassing a lone soldier guarding the customs house and throwing projectiles at him. Reinforcements arrived, and one of the soldiers, allegedly Hugh Montgomery, fired off a shot. A fusillade of bullets followed, and 5 people died as a result. The aftermath of the Boston Massacre led to increased colonial resistance, including the Boston Tea Party, where tea was dumped as revenge on its taxation, and eventually the American Revolution.